comments on the subject, the absence of which was lamented in a question before the break, which is what I think is somewhat neglected subject of medieval and late medieval Christianity, especially in Ireland. Certainly all the monuments around, or a large majority of them, come from that period, but for various reasons that perhaps it didn't fall quite into the tramlines of Irish history as interpreted a generation ago, there hasn't been the same focus on it. So to fill in that gap, as I say, is Professor Salvador Ryan. He's a native of Monagal, like the County Offaly, like the ancestors of President Obama. And he studied Nua Gaeilge and history at NUI Maynooth, and theology at St Patrick's College Maynooth, and indeed St Patrick's College Thurles, and indeed he does some of his work in Thurles and some of it in Maynooth. And he has taught the very important subject of church history. I remember one of his predecessors, the late Cardinal O'Fee, was a particularly distinguished ecclesiastical historian, and he showed, contrary to popular perception, that the first mention of an Irish republic in history was in 1627, when Owen Ruaidh O'Neill wrote to Philip IV of Spain, suggesting or proposing that an Irish republic be established under the protection of the Spanish crown. Anyway, without further ado, Professor Salvador Ryan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Could I just check before I start that everyone can hear me and that everyone at the back can hear me? Yes? If you can't at any stage, please raise your hand or start throwing things, preferably the former. It's the interior of Matthias's house in a darkened room, hushed with conspiratorial intrigue. Reg and Stan are seated at a table, and Francis, dressed in black robes, is standing by a plan on the wall. He addresses an audience of 8 masked activists. They're planning to kidnap Pilate's wife and to hold her ransom until their demands to dismantle the whole of the Roman operation in Palestine are met. The Romans. Reg ruminates on the dastardly deeds they've perpetrated over the years, and then he pipes up, prompting the following dialogue. They bled us white, so they have. They've taken everything we had. Not just from us, but from our fathers and our fathers' fathers. Yes. And from our fathers' fathers' fathers. Yes. And from our fathers' 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 fathers. All right, Stan, don't labour the point. And what have they ever given us in return? The aqueduct? Oh, yeah. They gave us that, all right. That's true. And the sanitation. Oh, yes. The sanitation, Reg. You remember what the city used to be like? All right. I grant you that the aqueduct and the sanitation are 2 things the Romans have done. And the roads. Well, yes, obviously the roads. I mean, the roads go without saying, don't they? But apart from the sanitation, the aqueduct and the roads, irrigation, medicine, education, yes, all right, fair enough. And the wine, where would we be without the wine? Oh yes, that's true. Public baths. And it's safe to walk in the streets at night, Reg. Yes, they certainly know how to keep order. Let's face it, they're the only ones who could in a place like this. All right, but apart from the sanitation, the medicine, education, public order, irrigation, the fresh water system, public baths, what have the Romans ever done for us? They brought peace. Oh, be quiet. Now, you'll be very familiar with this dialogue. This famous Monty Python scene might seem a curious place, though, to begin a reflection on Irish Christianity. But in many respects, it can offer a useful parallel at a time in our history when there are calls to shake off the shackles of what many have come to regard as the oppressive and overbearing power of the Christian Church. A body and a belief system which has exerted itself upon our fathers and our fathers' fathers and our fathers' fathers' fathers. And indeed, many have come to ask, what has Christianity ever done for us? Some going so far as to suggest that we would have been a whole lot better off had Patrick or the Christians before him never set foot on our shores. What has Christianity ever done for us? What indeed? In the short time we have to address such a large topic, allow me to offer some thoughts on this question, thoughts which will necessarily be of a general nature and painted in broad brush strokes. Let's begin at the very dawn of Christianity in Ireland then, and the figure of Patrick. Now, although we have known for a very long time now that Patrick did not introduce Christianity to Ireland, there were Christian communities there before he arrived, he can certainly be credited as a major contributor, perhaps the preeminent contributor towards its propagation. But my mention of Patrick will not restrict itself to a strictly religious significance for the Irish, who over time convert to Christianity. The author of two works of great significance, the Letter to Coroticus and his Confession, Patrick's status as an individual is much wider still. And it's of interest to historians of all faiths and of none. Firstly, he's the only individual from ancient Roman Britain that we truly get to know, simply on account of his authorship of these works. Secondly, he is the only citizen of the late Roman Empire to have been taken prisoner by raiders, to have been sold into slavery, and who lived to tell the tale, and indeed told it. Patrick's writings are the only existing Latin books of the time of the Roman Empire which were written outside of the imperial frontier in one of the lands of the so-called barbarians. His account is simply unique in the history of the West. Moreover, his writings are in fact the earliest composed documents in Irish history that survive. Through the curious contours of history, were it not for the patrician cult, the promotion of the figure of Patrick as a holy man by the Christian Church in Ireland, and particularly the Church at Armagh, we would most likely have never heard of him or his writings. And he's a hugely impressive figure, far more compelling than the caricature he would evolve into over later centuries, shrouded in fanciful legends and up to his neck in shamrockery of all kinds. With Christianity's arrival in Ireland, there also came writing, and over time literature. In addition, there came the introduction of the Julian calendar and a 7-day week, which in pre-Christian Ireland had been unknown. Whether this was a welcome arrival or not, I leave up to yourselves to judge. Writing became fundamental to the growth and development of early Irish Christianity. With the foundation of monasteries eventually came the inclusion of scriptoria within those monasteries, where monks would copy the scriptures, the writings of early church fathers, and devise collections of church law. Not only that, but over the succeeding centuries, much else would be preserved besides. We must remember that what glimpses we have of a pre-Christian pagan Ireland can be gleaned from our reading of the early Irish sagas, stories such as the Táin, and of course the wider Ulster and Fenian cycles featuring Cuchulainn and Fionn McCool respectively. These stories and their traditional elements, many of which have their origin in the orality of a pre-Christian and pre-literate Irish society, were preserved and transmitted to us today in a Christian context, in which books and writing was considered important. This This didn't necessarily have to be the case. Had they so wished, early Irish Christian monks and scholars might have attempted to airbrush the pagan world out of the picture, might have committed an act of literary vandalism that would ensure that no trace of the pre-Christian tradition remained. But that's not what they did. In fact, they chose to work at a number of levels with the pre-existing culture and essentially to work to baptize it. Sure, in the saints' lives, many of the pagans get their comeuppance, and Patrick is depicted as a John Wayne figure riding into town and into the saloon to zap a few of them before lunch. And early Irish Christian writers are not slow about shaping and honing these traditions to the benefit of the new dispensation. But they didn't adopt an iconoclastic approach to the culture, and thus they preserved a great deal. This can be seen also with regard to the sacred landscape, to holy sites such as sacred wells, trees, and sacred mountains. Irish Christians largely adopted the strategy that Pope Gregory I would advocate when he sent Augustine and his missionaries to England. Not to destroy the pagan shrines and temples necessarily, but to retain those with firm structures, to Christianize them, to baptize them. A wise approach indeed, even if it wasn't always followed. The story of Ireland's missionary ventures to the continent during this period is well known. From the early 7th century onwards, a large number of Irishmen embarked on peregrinatio to Britain and the continent. The choice to leave Ireland was as much symbolic as it was practical. To choose to voluntarily exile yourself was to relinquish your status in early Irish law. For instance, it might be like surrendering your passport today or surrendering your PPS number. Expulsion from Ireland was routinely used, for instance, as the ultimate sanction against criminals. They were cut off, as it were, from their kin. They were placed firmly outside of society. Therefore, what one was doing was voluntarily relinquishing one's status for Christ. Of course, this also brought some benefits, freeing the exile from social and legal obligations to family and the local community. This was certainly the position with peregrinatio in the early period. A little later, by 700 for instance, the peregrinus or voluntary exile had attained a privileged position in Irish society that was brought within the legal framework. And what began as an ascetical practice of renunciation was turned into a movement of evangelization. They arrived in the late 6th century, immediately focusing on the rural areas of Gaul, for instance, which had not been evangelized in any meaningful way when compared with the urban areas. The arrival of the Irish inaugurated the foundation of a wave of new monastic settlements. While some 220 monasteries existed in Gaul around the year 600, a further 320 more were added to the number in the 7th century alone under Irish influence, the great majority of these in northern Gaul. They were mainly in rural areas, not dependent on the local urban-based bishop, but on the patronage of a newly emerging Frankish society, or aristocracy. Now, these foundations played a crucial role in the re-Christianization of what had been frontier regions of the Roman Empire, and also allowed advance of missionary ventures to parts of Europe that had lain up to that point outside of Rome's control. The Irish were also seen as particularly suited to preaching to peoples beyond the borders of the old Roman Empire. The famous British monk scholar Bede of Jarrow once remarked that Gentiles learn best from Gentiles, meaning, of course, that non-Romans learn best from non-Romans. The tradition of Irish peregrini, these voluntary wanderers for Christ, travelling the length and breadth of Europe and settling and founding monasteries there, helped to internationalise the Irish, establishing a vast network of Irish foundations on the continent, and it ensured that although the Irish at home lived on an island, their mentality was anything but insular. This, I believe, has made an indelible impression on the Irish psyche right down to our own day. The wandering Irish of the 6th, 7th, 8th and 9th centuries would be succeeded by the waves of those of the 11th and 12th centuries, who would establish a number of Irish monastic foundations in the German Empire, for instance, many of them becoming known as the cluster of Schottenkloster, and which in turn contributed in many ways to the introduction of vital reforms to the Irish Church in the 12th century. The Irish in Europe becomes something of a running theme through Irish history, beginning again in earnest in the Tudor and Stuart periods of the 16th and 17th centuries, with the establishment of continental colleges in places like Paris, Douai, Bordeaux, Rome, Salamanca, Leuven, and many, many others. In many respects, it could be argued that the Irish were not long back in the country in the period after the penal laws before they were off again, this time from the early 20th century, joining missionary societies that travelled the length and breadth of the world, priests, brothers, religious sisters, and lay missionaries, to the extent that there was scarcely a remote corner of the world where Irish people were not located. In more recent years, of course, the countless numbers of religious missionaries has largely given way to the aid work of Irish lay volunteers, working with innumerable NGOs, aid organisations, and even still religious-run charities. Many of these workers may no longer profess formal attachment to the Christian Church, but the ideals which inspire them, selflessness, charity, compassion, a sense of justice, a desire to reach out, are profoundly Christian ideals in which the majority of these volunteers were schooled. This Irish wanderlust continues to exert a profound influence on the Irish psyche, ensuring that we remain one of the least insular of insular nations globally, which has helped us to punch far above our weight on the international stage. The roots of this characteristically Irish attitude to the wider world, I would argue, lie in the earliest period of Irish Christian evangelization on the continent. Among the most famous of these figures, of course, is Columbanus. We'll celebrate in 2015 the anniversary of his death. He dies in 615. Again, his significance is beyond just the obvious interest for Christians as an early Irish saint. Here was a man from the Leinster region who travelled to the continent, founded monasteries at Luxai, Annagray, Bobbio, who wrote boldly and with no little confidence to the Pope of the time, Gregory I, in favour of keeping the traditional Irish date for celebrating Easter, and whose Latin, in fact, was far superior to that of Pope Gregory himself, who, it must be admitted, was no intellectual slouch. In fact, Columbanus' level of Latin would be indicative of the high quality of the language that Irish scholars would attain. Learning Latin as a foreign language had its benefits, you know. During this time in the West, spoken Latin was gradually evolving into the newly emerging proto-versions of the Romance languages that would characterize the late 8th and 9th centuries. Thus, over time, former citizens of the Roman Empire gradually became more divorced from the Latin of religious texts, soon finding it difficult to read them properly and indeed to pronounce them properly. This might have serious consequences if a cleric, for instance, mispronounced or stumbled over words used in the sacraments. Might they be invalid as a result? If you use the wrong words in prayer, you don't pronounce them properly, is God going to be there and say, speak up, can't hear you? I know, just send me an Irish or Anglo-Saxon monk, they're able to speak it better. By contrast, early Irish Latin speakers were in no danger of slipping into the Romance languages, and having learned Latin as a foreign language, they tended to be more precise in their grammar, as oftentimes non-native speakers of a language are. Necessity being the mother of invention, they also tended to produce much more effective and comprehensive books of Latin grammar for learners. So thus, Irish scholars would be in big demand in the Europe of the Carolingian dynasty, the Europe of Charlemagne and his successors, who saw themselves as reinvigorating intellectual life across the continent in what has come to be called the Carolingian Renaissance. Charlemagne and his successors promoted the study of classical Latin texts to bring the Latin of the religious up to speed and to ensure that they avoided slip-ups, either in liturgy or the copying of manuscripts. The Irish, unaffected by Romance slippage, so to speak, were regarded as ideal scholars to effect this change in Europe. So I suppose in Thomas Cahill's words about, the Irish save civilization, This is perhaps something of a stretch, of course, if claimed exclusively for the Irish. It could, for instance, be more fittingly claimed, for instance, for the Arabs, who would preserve the writings of many of the classical authors and philosophers like Aristotle, for instance, in Arabic before reintroducing these writers to the medieval West in the 11th and 12th centuries. But nevertheless, there is something in Cahill's claim about the Irish. As foreign learners of Latin, the Irish had composed Latin grammars, and they were in big demand. But they also had attempted to make the reading of manuscripts, and thus the avoidance of scribal errors, easier. One of the ways in which they did this was to abandon what was called the scriptura continua, in which if you were reading a manuscript, the succession of words appeared in manuscripts one after the other without any space or breaks between them. In this older way of presenting texts, you really needed to know where a word began and ended if you were to get the sense of the passage, and it made copyists more prone to mistakes and to eye skips, to actually skipping lines sometimes or skipping words. The Irish, to counteract this, introduced spacing between the words and also punctuation to make reading easier. They also highlighted the beginning of a text by enlarged or decorated initials. Many of these features are found from as early as the late 600s in Ireland, from where they were exported to the continent. In the 8th century, Charlemagne and his successors set in train the major project of recovering the best, the oldest and most authentic versions of religious texts, such as the Bible and the writings of the Church Fathers, sending scholars, many of them Irish, across Europe in order to compare large numbers of texts and purge later copies of errors and prepare critical editions of reliable texts. Thus the volume of book production rockets in the 9th century. The sheer volume is seen, for instance, in the fact that we have roughly about 1,800 books or fragments surviving from before this period, up to 800. But in the 9th century, there are 9,000 from the 9th century alone. He and his successors, Charlemagne that is, with the help of scholars such as Alcuin of York, would also adopt and adapt features introduced by the Irish. Indeed, the very words that we read on pages of every book to this day, arranged as they are in lowercase, what becomes known as Carolingian minuscule, complete with spaces and punctuation, is largely thanks to Christian scholars who were anxious that the scriptures and liturgical texts be properly transmitted. In fact, the reason it's now the standard in book production is because of Renaissance scholars much later who raid the monasteries for classical texts, and they find this Carolingian minuscule writing and they actually believe it to belong to the classical past, and then it becomes used, for instance, in Roman typefaces of the period. In placing such emphasis on classical Latin learning, monastic scholars also helped to preserve in newly commissioned manuscripts the vast majority of Latin classical texts in monastic scriptoria of the Carolingian period, many of which contained Irish scholars. Indeed, over 90% of the whole corpus of the pagan works of ancient Rome that we possess today appear in their earliest form in Carolingian manuscripts of the 9th century. And of the Latin classical works that managed to survive up to the year 800, little has been lost since. This is one enormous debt that we owe the Carolingians, and by extension the large number of Irish monks who worked in monastic scriptoria across Europe. It is, of course, more fundamentally an inestimable debt that we owe to Christianity. But there were other ways in which the Irish contributed to Europe and to European Christianity. Columbanus and others transmitted to the continent a novel form of private penance that could be repeated as often as one wished, a departure from the older sort of public penance whereby you could actually get forgiveness for your sins once in your life after baptism if you were allowed to do this long public penance. Now penance could be repeated again and again, and it would impact itself not only on monks and clergy but also on lay Christians, and would over time evolve into what we know as the sacrament of penance today. The emphasis would not be so much on punishment per se, but on the treatment of sin as an illness, a condition that needed to be remedied. But some of the penances could contain quite practical prescriptions also, as in this example from the Penitential of Columbanus. It says, "If any of the laity has shed blood in a brawl, or wounded or maimed his neighbour, let him be compelled to restore all the damage he's done. But if he's nothing to pay with, let him first attend to his neighbour's work while he's sick, and call in a doctor, and after his recovery, let him then do penance for 40 days on bread and water." Now, Columbanus was a voluminous writer, and he's left us monastic rules, penitential letters, sermons, and some poems. Robert Schumann, in fact, architect of the European Union, would describe him as the patron saint of those who seek a united Europe. In one place, Columbanus stated, "We are all joint members of one body, whether Franks or Britons or Irish or whatever our race may be. Thus let all our races rejoice in the unity of faith and our knowledge of the Son of God." There's also, of course, the not sufficiently known Irishman Scotus Erugena, whose mastery of Greek was so rare in Europe of that time. Erugena, most likely trained in Ireland, was a theologian at the court of the Emperor of Charles the Bald in the mid-9th century, and his mastery of Greek was so good and so rare that he translated into Latin some of the most important thinkers of the Byzantine Church in the East, thus allowing their thought to enter the Western bloodstream, as it were. Having discussed this period of Irish Christian expansion and noted its contribution to European culture, it would be wrong, though, to simplistically term this a golden age of Irish Christianity, as tended to be claimed in the past. In my estimation, there are no golden ages. Christianity, in each period of its history, has been faced with profound challenges and has been preached by men and women of great insight and sanctity, but also by men and women of deeply mixed motivation and deeply flawed character. History, as we historians know, can be quite messy indeed. In particular, church historians who are honest with themselves and the evidence are under no illusions about golden ages, or about lands reductively branded as saintly and scholarly. A simple trawl through the penitential literature of the early Irish Church, that is, the comprehensive list of sins and penances, is a real eye-opener as to what kinds of sins were being routinely committed during these days by both laity and clergy. I can assure you they make for very salutary reading. And the early Irish were just as imaginative in their range of depravities as any generation that came after them. Early medieval Christian Ireland was also a profoundly violent place, with monasteries and church foundations often entering battle with each other, in which clerics were principal combatants and during which many massacres were perpetrated. But there were also attempts to remedy this situation. This is the context, for instance, for the promulgation of the Coin Adamnan, the Lex Innocentium, the Law of Innocence, promulgated at the Synod of Birr in 697, which was designed to ensure the safety of many non-combatants in Irish warfare, women, children and clerics, and which prescribed harsh penances for those who violated it. One suspects, though, it was of somewhat limited effect. But nonetheless, this effort of Adamnan, successor of Columkill and Iona, was the first systematic effort to stem the cycle of violence in early Ireland. The Christian Church was often at the forefront of peace initiatives among warring populations. It would later make strenuous efforts, for instance, to curb the phenomenon of the violent culture of medieval knights in the continent by means of the Peace of God and Truce of God movements, which laid down regulations regarding the involvement of innocents. Incidentally, a more prosaic example of peace-building on a local scale, which Colman O'Clabbig has recently drawn attention to, occurred in Drogheda in 1412, when reconciliation was achieved between two communities living at opposite sides of the Boyne River, as a result of a sermon preached by a Dominican friar on the feast of Corpus Christi. Inviting members of both factions to St. Peter's Church in Drogheda, the friar took as his theme Psalm 133, which notes how good and pleasant it is when brothers live in unity. His sermon must have been effective, for soon after both factions were reconciled and they proceeded to jointly petition the king for a charter of incorporation, establishing Drogheda as one single united borough. In instances such as these, Christianity was the motivation for peace building and the work of reconciliation. something the Christian organisations and their members have continued to strive for in many troubled regions across the world. But beyond its work of peace-building, and in a way that touches each one of us at various levels, Christianity has over the centuries taught us about pain and suffering and death, and has given us a mechanism with which to deal with them. The cross of Christ, the object of devotion and veneration for Irish Christians over the centuries, has stood as a standard, chiselled in stone and carved in wood, witnessing to the profound mystery of suffering and death, even if not necessarily solving or explaining it. Indeed, it might be said that death and its celebration is one of the things the Irish continue to do very well, drawing upon a natural, earthy and matter-of-fact approach and a confidence in Christ's promise of the resurrection. I think this is captured very well in the story of an old Irish woman who was on her deathbed and who had asked her family gathered round her to read some prayers for the dying over her. Each of her family members in turn took up the prayer book to begin the recitation of the said prayer, and each in turn didn't get far before breaking down in tears under a weight of emotion. As this scene continued, and the prayers had still not been said, the dying old woman raised herself up in the bed and snatched the prayer book from her daughter's hand while muttering, "Yet give it to me, I'll say them over myself." Now, the image of Mary standing at the foot of the cross of her Son is perhaps one of the most powerful and heart-rendering of religious scenes. It's no surprise that she was routinely invoked when the Passion became too close for comfort, as in the mid-14th century, when the Black Death was at its height in Europe. It became particularly important at this time that Mary was depicted as sharing the suffering of Christ by her compassion, her suffering with, and by extension her sharing in the suffering of humanity as a whole. The silent, calm and collected figure of Mary stands stoically by the cross as her Son hangs dying, a figure of faith, trusting that God would ensure that everything would turn out all right in the end. Now there's much to be learnt, I think, from this poignant scene. The writer and palliative care specialist Sheila Cassidy, in her work Sharing the Darkness, takes inspiration from the image of Mary standing at the foot of the cross, and she writes, "In the care of the dying, as in many other fields of endeavour, there comes a time when the carer's hands are empty, when all the treatment manoeuvres have been explored, all the words of comfort said. And it's then that one is left standing at the foot of the bed, useless, impotent, wanting more than anything else to run away. It's here that we must learn the spirituality of the foot of the cross, the stance of the impotent bystander." She goes on to speak of the importance of powerlessness by saying, "The secret is not to be afraid of it, not to run away. The dying know that we are not God. They accept that we cannot halt the process of cancer, the inexorable march of that terrible army that takes over a human body like an occupying force, pillaging, raping, desecrating without respect and without quarter. All they ask is that we do not desert them, that we stand our ground at the foot of the cross. And at this stage of the journey of being there, of simply being, it is in many ways the hardest part." But there are other traditions surrounding the Virgin, which present her as far more outspoken at the death of her Son. This is the much rawer version of the lament, the keening Virgin. And this Virgin would give rise to some of the most hauntingly beautiful melodies in the native Irish tradition, such as Seach No Loss na Maidin an Mhuire, the Seven Dolours of Mary. Alleluia, Alleluia, Stomalana, Alleluia, Sturigad Navlas. Indeed, in Irish folklore, it was often said that it was the Virgin Mary who began the custom of the Cuine, or the keening, when she invited the other two Marys at the cross to join with her in lamenting her Son. And this Cuine would play a huge part in Irish wakes and funerals until the practice was curbed by church authorities in the 18th and 19th centuries. And yet the keener often voiced the labyrinth of emotions of the grieving family at times when they mightn't have had the physical strength to do so for themselves. She performed an essential social service, and this was traditionally recognised in the payment of professional lamenters. There was something in the Church's recognition of the necessity of presenting the rawness of death and grief in the figures of Christ and Mary during the later Middle Ages and beyond. It connected in a real way with the messy reality of loss experienced by ordinary Christians. Now, Christianity always needed to perform a balancing act between the pain of Good Friday and the joy of Easter Sunday. And sometimes church representatives have gotten the balance wrong. My own grandmother, I'm told, was censured by a priest in the 1940s for mourning the death of her 14-year-old daughter who had recently died from an asthma attack. He regarded this as a lack of belief on her part in her daughter's enjoyment of the afterlife. But such consolation as the prospect of an afterlife is not compassion, not in the short term. This is not a suffering with. Rather, it's a hastily assembled bypass to avoid encountering the heavy traffic of raw grief, a short-circuiting of the natural grieving process. Just as in this example of my grandmother, in one of the Irish-speaking areas of the country, a woman was once admonished by a priest officiating at her son's funeral for lamenting him, and was told that she should accept the will of God. And she replied, and it's given in verse, Eish the hagart agus shasig dieruk, leig an tafran is yoid to dilas, nir hogged she three rohe in himmel de chriagat, na namely na deag or food and tiat. Wished, priest, and stand up straight and read the Mass and you'll get paid. He didn't spend 9 months next to your heart or 19 years around your house. This woman's experience clearly points to a disconnect between what the priest considered the appropriate Christian response to death and the reality experienced by the grieving mother. Incidentally, I teach at a Catholic seminary as well as a pontifical university, and I suppose thankfully nowadays our students benefit from a more thorough formation in pastoral care, something which wouldn't have featured in the professional training of this priest I mentioned. Christianity continues to learn. Ireland's history and culture has been intimately shaped by its Christianity. It's inspired countless of its citizens to travel to the furthest corners of the earth, to devote their lives to preaching the gospel, feeding the hungry, caring for the sick, and peace-building. And Christianity has given it much back in return, not least the inspiration for great and humble works of art, literature, music, and architecture. It's given us the first performance of Handel's Messiah. It has given us the hymns of Wesley. It's given us carols at Christmas. It's given us Christmas. It's given us the Book of Kells in the monastic settlement of Clonmacnoise. And much of our greatest literature is inextricably tied to our Christianity, whether praising it, celebrating it, critiquing it, or castigating it. Christianity has also shaped the way we speak, both Irish and English. It's very difficult, in fact, to greet someone in Irish without invoking the Christian God and his blessing in some way. Bala Yurt, Diagwit, Diavermahasa, Gomani Diayiv. It's also given us words, phrases, expressions to colour our language. The most well-known examples which still pepper our speech today are drawn from William Tyndale's English translation of the Bible, much of which was incorporated into the more famous authorised version of King James' Bible in 1611. Without these texts, we wouldn't speak of a broken heart, a labour of love, a leopard changing its spots, a peace offering, sign of the times, a wolf in sheep's clothing, biting the dust, casting the first stone, no rest for the wicked, nothing new under the sun, out of the mouths of babes, the land of Nod, giving up the ghost by the skin of your teeth, and the writing is on the wall. And so many other elements of our lexicon that we breathe effortlessly, often without realizing their provenance. Today, well into the second decade of the 21st century, when our relationship with Christianity and its legacy to us is complex to say the least, we reassess where we have come from. We've spent a good deal of time exploring the Irish Christian contribution to education and learning in its earliest centuries, for instance. This, as we know, continued in various forms through the centuries and into the modern period. And notwithstanding the well-known criticisms of harsh treatment in schools, even the sharpest critics of the Christian Church routinely pay tribute to orders such as the Jesuits, Ursulines, Sacred Heart, Spiritans, Mercy, Presentation, and Christian Brothers for the solid academic grounding they provided and for teaching their students to think critically. Christian schooling has also given us a voice to express concern for the downtrodden and to challenge injustice. Indeed, it's precisely that voice that has risen up in recent years to call the Christian Church itself to account over its many lamentable failings in the area of child sexual abuse. Even here, though, there is hope. The history of Christianity globally and also in Ireland has necessarily been one of ongoing reform and renewal. From groups such as the Céilí Day in the 9th century, which wished to restore some of the zeal of the earlier centuries of monasticism, to people like St. Malachy and the 12th century Reform. From the arrival of the Cistercian and Mendicant orders in the Middle Ages, to calls and the gradual implementation of reforms in the 16th and 17th centuries, which are again, in an Irish context, certainly in terms of Catholic Reformation, more fully embedded in the 19th century, and on to the age of Vatican II and beyond. We can only trust that that pattern of renewal will continue. So to conclude, to paraphrase the Python sketch, what has Christianity ever done for us? Has it indeed taken everything from our fathers and our fathers' fathers and our fathers' fathers' fathers? And are we better off unshackling ourselves from its oppressive hold? The Thurles poet who died all too young, Dennis O'Driscoll, in his poem Missing God, suggests that this is not always a clean break. He says, "Yet though we rebelled against him like adolescents, uplifted to see an oppressive father banished, a bearded hermit to the desert, we confess to missing him at times." And yet, as we've seen, I think, Christianity has been part of our very DNA for some 1500 years. It's in the very language we speak, in how we view the world, even in our very struggles to cast it off. And yet, wouldn't it be a shame to do so before we fully appreciated the legacy it has bequeathed to us, warts and all, and which has shaped who we are and where we have come from? Thank you.